And welcome Yana, and welcome everyone who's joining us from many different countries today. This is the 19th webinar program in our series Come and Learn, instituted a number of months ago in order to keep people in touch with one another about developments today regarding, unfortunately, global anti-Semitism, which has become resurgent. We've already touched on some of those developments in a number of countries. Today, thanks to Yana Grinshpun, we're going to be looking specifically at France. Anyone who follows the news from Europe knows that France was in many respects the epicenter, in fact, of hostility against Jews. In many ways, that's not past history, but in different forms continues, as our speaker today will tell us. Yana was born in Latvia, educated in Israel, Belgium, and in France. She claims Russian, French, Hebrew, and English among some of her languages, and she's fluent in all of those. No surprise, therefore, that in her teaching and in her research at the Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris, she focuses especially on discourse analysis and how language refracts what we come to know about the subject we're going to be looking hard at today. In addition to teaching, she participates in a research network that focuses ongoing attention on racism and anti-Semitism. In short, she's got her finger on the pulse of developments as they unfold in France, and we will learn lots from her for sure. Yana, it's my pleasure now to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored and pleased to be invited to this talk. And well, I'll do my best and my shortest to inform you about what's happening here. So I will start right away. And as I promised, there were three parts of my talk. The first will introduce the philosophical background in which the whole thing happens. The second will be more historical, and the third one will be dedicated to a case study and to one of the trials that interested a lot the whole world. So I'll start about the whole landscape in which the new anti-Semitism takes root. It is a lot wasted than the hatred of the Jews in general. The new anti-Semitism here, actually in Europe, it's a part of a general crisis of the democratic regime. This in part results from a dominant ideology, which covers many fields today. The dominant ideology is a system of ideas, beliefs, representations, which impose itself on our consciousness without our being aware of it. These ideas seem obvious, but often we don't see the basis that governs their promotion. This ideology is often called post-Modernism. It was born in France in the 60s. It didn't have a lot of success here in France, but it did in the American universities. The public birth of it is given in 1966 in Johns Hopkins University by a conference that brought Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, and other philosophers to the United States, and they came all together for the first time. There they had quite an unprecedented status that can be called by the term thought masters. This ideology targets modernity. Modernity is no longer described as enlightenment, as the rule of the law or the state, or the reason, but is presented as domination, capitalism, ethnocentrism, and colonialism. Those are new forms of actually very old Marxist ideas. This ideology focuses on the collapse of what it calls a dominant narrative. To put it simply, all narrative structures that support modern history, philosophy, literature, and religion, all the main narratives that allow people to feel they're belonging to a particular culture, people, language, lifestyle, and traditions, turned out to be, in this philosophical analysis, a fiction and an invention of dominant philosophical doctrines. The main idea of this new trend is that there are no universal values. These are all relics of the past. There is only a variety of micro-narratives that are characteristic of our post-modern era. What is important is not an empirical reality, but what is constructed by the language, or more exactly by the discourse, which according to this new disposition has an extraordinary performative power. The modern philosophical thought conceives breaking up between words, things, and the world. The deconstruction reduces things only to words. Well, yesterday, the critical examination of things made it possible to verify the accuracy of the words, which had to inform us about reality. Today, reality is nothing more than a text, so that its reading doesn't refer to external things, but to words. Today, I say that I'm a woman. Tomorrow, I say that I am a man. And here you are to respect my sayings because this is my micro-narrative. The problem is that this text or narrative is not supposed to have a beginning, an end, or even an author. Reality is presented as a narrative, again, and the narrative is the invention of human groups and individuals who put themselves on stage in this kind of storytelling. This ideology declares that the past is an invention of a dominant group and needs to be reinvented. From this conception of reality derives a set of far-reaching effects. There is no longer any foundation for reality since the reality is evanescent. It's all the construction of discourse. There are no longer truths or ultimate values. The key word of this ideology is this deconstruction. The deconstructed subject is available in all its forms, and the nation embodies the political subject who holds the monopoly of state power and coercion. It has to be then deconstructed. The idea of a people is also a narrative that has to be deconstructed. Shlomo Zand, the representative of the School of New Israeli Historians, says that the Jewish people is just an invention and it doesn't exist. And this is a very good example of this movement. There is no longer any collective identity, especially when it's national. It has to be banned. Besides that, we are witnessing the essentialization of particular identities, women, white, black, and so on. So the result of this systematic deconstruction is the deconstruction of any coherent narrative, of any consequent thoughts, of any real existence. The world is floating, the reality is liquid, the gender is fluid. Judith Butler says, for instance, being a woman is an attribute of any gender. The human subject is undetermined. The deconstruction of a collective subject is the central subject of this theory. And the criticism of the nation as a concept and a reality is one of the principal positions of this theory. The idea of nation is confronted today with the idea of minorities. It is not a quantitative notion, but a qualitative one. The nation is to disappear to the benefit of what is called the international community. It is very difficult to define this concept. We don't know what it is. In France, normally we talk about the international community when it comes to saying that this community has to condemn Israel. If the gender doctrine seeks to dismantle the individual subject, his identity, the idea of the family and affiliation, the criticism of the nation seeks to demolish or dismantle the collective identity. And the very incarnation of the nation is the state of Israel today. In 2014, there was a book called Deconstructing Zionism, published by Gianni Vattimo and Michael Marder. And this book is very important. It has an important meaning and influence in France. I will just show you just a second. Well, here we go. Yes. So here's the quotation from this book that is very popular, especially in French universities. So Vattimo he claims to be an anti-Zionist, and he enlisted in his cause major figures of this deconstruction theory I was talking about, such as Judith Butler or Slavoj Žižek or Walter Mignolo. I will talk about him a little bit later. They are all influential postmodern philosophers. The raison d'etre of this moment, of this book and of this anti-Zionist monument is defined as following by Vattimo. And here he quotes Derrida, the father of the deconstruction. Derrida once said that deconstruction is the possibility of justice. He had in mind deconstruction's extreme sensitivity to the context of its engagements, as much as the subtle forms which violence can assume, for instance, in the name of universality. To deconstruct Zionism is therefore to demand justice for its victims, not only for Palestinians who are suffering from it, but also for the anti-Zionist Jews, erased from the officially consecrated account of Zionist theory. Well, and then he continues, the second technical meaning of deconstruction has to do with its specifically Derridian or Heideggerian connotations. Taken in this sense, deconstruction is something more than a good old ideology critique. It's a critique of the metaphysics of presence. In this book, Zizek, Slavoj Zizek claims that Zionists are the real anti-Semites. Deconstruction, as he and his co-authors explain in Deconstructing Zionism, must also eradicate Judaism. On the Qatari channel Al Jazeera, Zizek, whose contribution opens Deconstructing Zionism, became the official commentator of the Arab revolutions. He warned them against Western democracies and elective democracy, little appreciated by the regimes of the Gulf. In a tribute to Derrida, another author, Santiago Zabala, another contributor of the book, warns also on the Al Jazeera site against those who still believe in nostalgic and dangerous ideas, I quote, like objectivity, reality, truth, values as preconditions of democracy, because it is about, I quote, the search for fanatic and absolute affirmations. So this ideological disposition stems from two major events, of course more, but I'm simplifying here in order to continue about France. What happened 20 years ago, 40 years ago actually, was the fall of the USSR. In the 1990s, the same intellectuals who defended the political Marxism rediscovered themselves as Democrats in the aftermath of the fall of the wall. They invested liberal democracy by discovering the threat of the post-war Jewish community and the state of Israel weighed on its universality, that of human rights. A very interesting description of this phenomenon is given by Vladimir Bukovsky, a Soviet dissident who describes the role of the latter, I mean Soviet intellectuals, within the European Union. And he talks about it in one of his latest books that is called The European Union, New USSR. The second event is the advent of the post-colonial era. It implies a massive immigration from former colonized countries. The West has experienced and is experiencing the massive arrival of populations with a Muslim cultural background that have to some degree altered some of the European cultural fabric. The arrival, coupled with the ideology of post-colonial studies initiated by Edward Said's influence, includes the post-colonial movement that is currently evolving in what is called decoloniality or decolonialism, and openly claims an essential and existential opposition to the West and Israel, which is considered to be the quintessence of the European evil. The main idea of this movement is that the ex-colonizers are a dominant majority and ex-colonized a dominant minority. Even though those ex-colonized were born in France and their parents were born in France, there is a sort of original sin of white Europeans and Jews whose victims are the indigenous people. It's a sort of semantic perversion in case of France, since those who call themselves indigenous are French, be they of Muslim origins. This movement, decolonialism, occurs in a very particular moment when European countries are weakened by the unification of Europe. The creation of the European Union has as a consequence the weakening of a national identity. Besides, the post-colonialism states that colonization has not yet stopped and that France continues to be a colonial country. It means, according to this logic, that ex-colonized who live today in the metropolis or the ex-colonizer after they chased them from the colony that has become the independent state, like Algeria, for instance, are always colonized. Well, that is, for example, the claim of both PIR, le Parti des Indigènes de la République, Party of the Indigenous of the Republic, the radical left, and all the Islamist organizations like Muslim Brotherhood. I will talk about it in a minute. According to the new ideological disposition, the West has the guilt of its infamous colonial past, and this guilt is unwashable. even in front of the fourth generation grown up and educated in France. These ideas are largely supported and promoted by Muslim Brotherhood, whose massive coring in the social structures is well known and undiscussable fact. On the contrary, according to the same ideology, all the rest of the world, especially Muslims and Africans, are declared to be innocent and victims of the European colonialism. The victims have all the right for the reparation. In general, speaking about the Western world and about Europe, social legitimacy today is based on victimization. This post-colonial movement gave birth to a younger political offspring, this decolonialism I was talking precedently. It's a decoloniality. It's a school of thought emerged in Latin American post-colonial movement, which focuses on untangling the production of knowledge from what they claim is a primarily Eurocentric episteme. It is inspired by the post-Marxist and third world theories. It critiques the universality of Western knowledge and the presumed superiority of Western culture. Decolonial perspectives see this hegemony as the basis of Western imperialism. Decolonial thought transfers the status of innate victim of the Western domination to the group. Being a collective victim opens up a recognition that is not without affinities of the positive discrimination. It was within this movement that the idea of systematic or systemic racism was born in the United States of America, and today it is applied to Europe, and we see it in France. The systemic racism is a synonym of another invention, state Islamophobia. Decolonial anti-racism gives a large place to this Islamophobia, which is said to be a form of anti-Muslim racism. Of course, the idea is strange because a religion is not a race, okay? But the concept of Islamophobia has a triple function here. First, it makes it possible to victimize Muslims in order to bring them together behind the brotherhoods, first and foremost, that of the Muslim Brotherhood, especially in France. Second, it posits that Arab identity can only be defined by Islam to the detriment of Arab atheists or Christians or any other. It is precisely this assertion which makes it possible to declare an apostate and to condemn, sometimes to death, any atheist Arab if he had been a Muslim by birth. The highest authority of Sunni Islam, the University of Al-Azhar, thus condemned President Macron's speech of October the 2nd in 2020 on Islamist separatism, and in particular described him and France as racist, as if Islamists were a race. Third, it censors any critique of Islam. It's a sort of paradox that the legitimation of Islam, and very often Islamism, is done by the radical left, who presents it as progressive, anti-Western and post-colonial movement. Despite all we know about the fate of secular and democrats in Islamic states, like in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, and Iran, or in Pakistan. The promoting of a label like Islamophobia implies that Islam in France is defined as a cultural and political victim of the state. As the collective against Islamophobia in France well understood, such a position is ideologically supportive and allows creating a polarization, precisely generating amalgams. Two, the word carries with it the idea that Islamophobia is the Muslim condition itself, and that France is thus only an apartheid land. Here we have the ingredients of how a conflicting social construction, a Manichaeism, which sets the trap of identifying and recruiting Muslim against France, which according to this ideology suffers from Islamophobia. Now the word Islamophobia is constructed on the model of Judeophobia, and its promoters claim that any critique of Islam is a proof of Islamophobia. Muslims are depicted by these ideologues as victims, oppressed, and persecuted population, like were Jews before and during the World War II. And here we finally come to the anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has been replaced by Islamophobia according to this dogma, to the point that the contemporary left doxa is that Muslims are the Jews of today. Now I will show you another quotation, which is quite important. Here we go. So this is the example, excuse me, of Enzo Traverso when he says, in his book, The End of Jewish Modernity, Islamophobia plays a role for the new racism that anti-Semitism had in the past. The memory of the Holocaust, a historical perception of anti-Semitism through the prism of its culmination in genocide, tends to obscure these clear analogies. The portrait of the Arabs or Muslims sketched by contemporary xenophobia does not differ much from that of the Jew constructed by anti-Semitism in the early 20th century. It is in fact a denial of the Judeophobia existence. The anti-Semitism Enzo Traverso is speaking about has never disappeared. It is transformed into the demonization of Zionism and Israel. Actually, this ideological landscape is not new. It is largely inspired by the tradition of inversion that has been inaugurated by the theology of substitution, which is called supersessionism, well, actually by Christian tradition. I won't talk about it today, just remind that it starts with the text of St. Paul, who probably was not the origin of it, but he was interpreted by the fathers of the church later. He proposes to forge a new universal identity, new Israel, that will replace the old one and leave the Jews dismissed to their peculiarity and singularity. All the nations may be part of this universalism, but not Jews. It's a sort of universalism -1. The fall of the ancient Israel will assure the rise of the new one. There is an illustration that can show that. Well, you all know, you've been traveling through Europe, and the well-known medieval allegory sculpture, ecclesia and synagogue, or the church and the synagogue, that can be often seen on church portals in Europe. The synagogue with the blindfolded eyes and the victorious church illustrates that quite well. Here I show you the sculpture. Well, this narrative of inversion started by Christianity is then picked up by Islam, because Quran says that the Jews have perverted the word of Allah, and then the radical left uses the same procedure, replacing ancient figures by new ones. The stages of this replacing are the following. We go from the proletarian cause to the Palestinian cause, from working class to immigrants of Muslim culture, from Jewish victims to Muslim victims, from communist revolutionaries to Islamist or leftist revolutionaries, or hybrid revolutionaries, if I can say. So from communist to Islamist. Actually, with the rise of the Palestine Liberation Organization in the mid-60s, anti-Zionism underwent an ideological change, which imposed itself thanks to unprecedented justifications, likely to elicit the support of new European generations. After the extermination of 2/3 of European Judaism, anti-Semitism has become taboo in Europe. No one is says he's anti-Semite. But it was the creation of PLO in the back office of the Soviet propaganda that changed the game. The PLO from the very beginning is engaged in the most sophisticated psychological warfare to rally European public opinion. It is the immense sums allocated by the European Union which allowed to instill its narrative in the Western world. This was amply relied by the media and especially by the university. Well, our left is always ready to ignite for great causes. And now at the university, the colonialism of Israel and the Zionism of Israel are widely denounced. From the outset, the propaganda put the term Zionism to work in contexts favorable to its pejoration, while by this same logic, the epithet Zionist resounded like an invective. If the right-wing parties and their Islamic allies are characterized by the Jew hatred and Israel, and this since the Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Alamin Husseini, established a solid cooperation with Nazis during the World War II, well, I will show you just one picture of his visit to Treblinka, but I think the specialists among you know very well. Here we go. Well, you see on this picture, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, in 1943, visiting Treblinka, and he was a great friend of Goebbels and Hitler. So if that was the cause of the radical right, the radical left has met Islamic fundamentalism in the common hatred for imperialists, capitalists, and colonialism, America and Israel. All the stages of this convergence are well described in the last new book of Pierre-André Taguieff, Liaisons Dangereuses, Dangerous Liaisons. And well, I invite you to read it if you can. It's not translated into English, but it's available, maybe will be available very soon. Well, he gives a very interesting example of this convergence. He takes as an example a Venezuelan terrorist, Carlos the Jackal, whom you probably know, who was called Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, who's currently serving a life sentence in France. So he was a Marxist-Leninist, and from Marxist-Leninist, he has converted to Islam, and he became a Muslim. He was engaged in Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, proud of killing more Jews than any local jihadi. He then glorified bin Laden, explaining that jihad is the most effective arm against imperialism. For him, and for those who share his views, the salvation comes both from the left and from the Islamic movements. The left doesn't see any contradiction in repeating Lenin saying that the religion is opium for the people, but not all of the religions are opium. Islam is not. In half a century of the semantic weaving, public opinion in France has been accustomed to reacting to the same associative field, equivalent to a ready-to-think, intended to produce a vicious lexical circle, cancellation of reflection, of historical knowledge and criticism. What people know here very well, that they perfectly incorporated the anti-Zionist archive with its four very pragmatical equations, as Georges Elias Sarfati says. Zionism equal Nazism, Zionism equal imperialism, Zionism equal racism, and Zionism equal apartheid. And actually, from my personal experience, I'm teaching the media discourse in Sorbonne Nouvelle. When I ask my students what they know about apartheid, they don't say what they know, but they say, we know where it is. It's in Israel. So here is a proof. This equations all their effectiveness to making the denotation of the term Zionism coincide with all these ideologies which have marked the history of the West, but which morality condemns. The left-wing anti-Semites didn't shrink from the argument explaining that Zionism was engaged in a conspiracy against Palestinians. They share the belief that Zionists are powerful, ruthless, and cunning, stopping at nothing to pursue their goals. Israel is regularly presented in these discourses, in media discourses, and some academic discourses as a bloodthirsty and racist state. The Palestinians, on the other side, are invariably depicted as poor, homeless, or downtrodden, as were Jews after the exile. For many pro-Palestinian activists in the West, they have assumed the mantle of the crucified people. We can see this in this narrative. The Jews didn't only kill Christ, but they are repeating their crime today. And thus they are committing both the crime of genocide and deicide. And what is interesting, here is a quotation from, and here I can find it maybe over here, I hope I still, here is JeanLuc Melenchon, who is the chief leader of the left party France Insoumise, who said a year ago in a public interview, I don't know if Jesus was one on the cross. I know who put him there. It seems those are his own compatriots. So you see, and now we find all the stereotypes in the discourse of the left as well. And this is quite an interesting convergence. Consequently, the contemporary left-wing and postmodern narrative replaced this Christian scheme today. If Palestinians have occupied in the Western religious and secular mind the place of crucified Jesus, the Jews have turned from the persecuted people to a persecutor, a cruel and ruthless people of criminals who kill the innocent. This topic of the persecuted Jews who has become a persecutor has a big success in mainstream media. Here's an example from a highly publicized psychoanalyst, Elizabeth Rudinesco. Here she says, it is terrible, the worst possible thing that happened. The most persecuted people in history, after having created a state on their promised land, they have become persecutors in their turn. Doing so, they caused anti-Semite resonance around the world. This idea is clearly adopted by all the terrorists who give a legitimation to their acts. For instance, Mohammed Merah, the murderer of Jewish children in Toulouse, says, I kill the soldiers in France because in Afghanistan they kill my brothers. I kill Jews in France because the same Jews kill innocent people in Palestine. So I had a precise aim in choosing my victims. Well, you see the convergence of all these discourses. This is the record that Mohammed Merah left actually before his death. Now, of course, this is a global picture, and it is not enough to understand what's going on in France. There is a particularism, a French particularism that starts, I would say, in 1967, with the victory of Israel in the Six-Day War and the defeat of Arabs. It coincided with the reversal of the French policy that progressively became not only anti-Israeli, it was pro-Israeli before, but especially anti-American. Raymond Aron, a prominent French philosopher, in his article Why, which was published in 1967, gives a brief essay of a kind of Sovietization of the French policy and its anti-American turn. The whys and wherefores of the negative role de Gaulle's policy played in this war is analyzed in a big number of essays. For our purpose, the important topic is that this victory, according to Aron, has opened in France what he called a new pro-Soviet and anti-American mood. The key point of what he called later the opening of the suspicion era was the famous de Gaulle's press conference given on the 27th of November, 1967. In this conference, de Gaulle draws up a panorama of the Jewish history and presents the Jewish people as a dominant and sure of himself elite people. He inverts the causes of the conflicts and accuses Israel to unleash the war against Arabs in order to conquer new territories and to increase its population. He also accuses Israel of the occupation accompanied by repressions and expulsions. One of the reasons of this inversion was the proclamation of independence of Algeria 5 years earlier. France, governed by de Gaulle, hoped to conquer the sympathy of the Arab world and the Soviet Union, which was the main ally of the Arab world by that time, by breaking its alliance with Israel. The victory of Israel was not only a humiliation of Arabs and their Soviet allies, but also the opening of a new era in the history of the contemporary anti-Semitism. For the left-wing party, the suspicion era, as Iran puts it, starts there. So a new component has appeared in this anti-Jewish propaganda in France on a regular basis, an anti-American hatred. Starts then a violent anti-Israeli propaganda in which AFP, French press agency, plays officially the main role. Another important stage, I won't talk about that longer, it was a Lebanon war that took place in 1982. The anti-Jewish passions of this period were neatly described by Leon Polyakov in his essay that has never been translated into English. It is called De Moscou à Beyrouth, Essai sur la désinformation, from Moscow to Beirut, the essay on disinformation. I probably can read it in French. And he describes how the propaganda, the anti-Israeli propaganda, never stopped since this unexpected victory, well, in the 6 Days War, and how it was maintained later. Just one reminiscence from this period, on the 12th of June, 1982, the French Prime Minister Pierre Mauroy declared, "It's not by distracting the Palestinian people that the terrorism would be reduced." So the principal source of the disinformation then was the French television, who represented Israel as an aggressive children killer and genocidal nation. Even if some marginal French reviews tried to contest the image of PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, as revolutionary or freedom fighters, reminding its nationalistic goals, the pro-governmental French media used systematically a well-oiled lexical patterns comparing Israel to Nazis like the Soviets did, Begin and Sharon to Hitler and Goebbels, Beirut to Oradour, a French village where Nazis exterminated the whole population, then Stalingrad to Warsaw Ghetto. Well, during this period, Alain Finkielkraut, a prominent French philosopher, wrote that the way the media discourse had constructed the image of the Jewish state, the systematic usage of words like genocide and Holocaust against Palestinians, one can uncover a sort of jubilation to finish once and for all with its bad conscience. The Jews have been stripped of their moral privilege of victims, and they have become kind again after they have been able for some decades. Europe has joyfully discovered its innocence due to the Israeli bombs on Beirut and Sabra and Shatila narrative. Now, since 2003 in France, there were 12 Jews killed on the basis of their origins without any other reason. Now I'm talking about facts. Though in 2 cases, the murderers thought that Jews were rich, So they had money, even if the latest victim, Mireille Knoll, lived in a social housing, so their crime was financially motivated. But neither the murder of Ilan Halimi, for which the anti-Semite motive wasn't at first taken into account, nor the Toulouse killing by Mohamed Merah, none of these events alerted mainstream French society to the gravity of the growing anti-Semitism in France. A wake-up call did come in the form of a mass demonstration on January 26 in 2014. It was known like the Day of Anger, Jour de Colère. Those pro-Palestinian manifestations included a heterogeneous group of militants shouting slogans like, "Jew, Jew, France does not belong to you. Jews, get out of France." And for the first time since the Holocaust, death to the Jews. The official media preferred not to mention it. In each case, when then later on Jewish individuals were murdered in France, the murderers, when they were not committing a collective attack, were declared to be mentally disturbed or unbalanced. To sum it up, there is anti-Semitism in France, but there are no anti-Semites. Well, they're only mentally disturbed. The name of the authors of the anti-Semite attacks would mean to acknowledge the existence of Muslim anti-Semitism, because all these 12 Jews were murdered by Muslims, Islamists or not. And it's very embarrassing to talk about that, because the declared victims of racism, as I was saying before, who are Muslims, cannot be persecutors according to this logic. I will now present one case study that will actually resume this talk, and I will talk about a particular anti-Semite crime that will probably allow me to show the link between the fear to talk about the role of Islam, the role of a contemporary anti-racism, whose essential component is the hatred of the Jewish state. As I said, no anti-Semite in France will ever recognize his anti-Semitism, neither on the left nor on the right, but many of them, including many university colleagues, declare themselves anti-Zionists. One of the last murders committed in France was the one of Sarah Halimi. It happened in 2017. She was murdered by her Muslim neighbor. She was 65. She was a retired doctor, mother of 3, and she was killed by a 27-year-old Muslim who had beaten her first and then threw her out of the window. He was crying, "Allah Akbar," and "I killed the shaitan." Well, you know, a devil in Arabic. The anti-Semite character of the murder had not been acknowledged immediately, and the representative of the Jewish community had to struggle for the recognition of this character. Well, the lady was thrown out of the window in front of the police, was waiting there in front of the building, and the murderer was judged in Paris in 2020, and he was considered finally criminally irresponsible, since under the effect of marijuana. The anti-Semite motive of the murder was first not taken into consideration, but then, yes, it was. The murderer, Kobili Traoré, he was judged mentally disabled in the moment of murder. In December 2019, the Paris Court of Appeal concluded that Kobili Traoré, the perpetrator, was criminally responsible. And this makes us ask a big question. Many Islamists, when they put into action the anti-Jewish vindictiveness that they draw from the sacred text, will pretend and that the exaltation that this gives them is followed by the state of self-absence and what is called abnormal agitation. Daniel Sibouni, a French psychoanalyst, asks a following question. Can one be in his normal state when he kills in the name of his God? Can one be without any trouble when this program of killing in the name of God is already in one's head? In the case of Traoré Kobili, he was agitated and pretty distraught, preparing himself to the action. He was not an experienced jihadi, but he snorts, if I can say, from time to time, the Quranic appeals, who point out the others as cursed by Allah or as figures of shaitan. The accusation he threw in the face of Sarah Halimi before throwing her away from the window was this one: she was a shaitan. But what happens here is that this agitation, quite normal in the context when one is to commit a murder, is cut from its context and is announced as signs of a mental trouble. It's enough that a psychiatrist recognizes that the psychic state of a murderer is not normal and a dismissal is pronounced. Nevertheless, according to French law, a sick person, mentally disturbed or other, can be discharged from the crime only if it is his illness that pushed him to commit the crime. It was not the case here, but the court and the psychiatrist declare that the agitated state of mind that preceded the crime is sufficient to declare the man irresponsible. He smoked a certain number of joints before the crime to give him courage, probably, to do what he did. He was aware of what he wanted to commit. So this pathological state has been provoked intentionally. So the conclusion is that if the preparation for the act can discharge one from any responsibility of the act, we are having here a caricature of judgment. That sounds like a recommendation to believers who follow the idea of killing the Jews: prepare your acts and that will avoid you any trial. Sibony points out that no one took seriously the idea that the act of killing Jews is not a simple murder, but a pious and devotional act. It's unsupportable to many people, and they prefer to find it mad or mentally disturbed, a result of mental illness. No one wants to go close to the text of Quran to see what these people say, because to go and to see the text means to be interested in religion, and that means violate secularism. France is a secular country. The problem is the difference between two cultures. The sentences, Jews are monkeys and Christian are pigs, or the variants that you can find in Surat number 5, Al-Maidah, the table, verse number 60. Nor one has to fight them every day. Sounds delirious to us, to Western ear, but these sentences are completely acceptable within an Islamic space. Of course, it doesn't mean that those who hear it are anti-Semites in the Western sense of the word, but for different reasons. If the sacred call touches them and they're eager to approach the sacred, they can put it in action. So why do the murderers escape the judgment and responsibility? Because any honest trial can put into light the condemnation of Jews written black on white in Quran. The terrorism claim to be inspired by the text, and if we are to take into account what's in the text, that's a problem, since the whole religion will be to be judged. The discourse of the sacred text is read and intoned several times a day in every place where religion is mentioned. It is accompanied by hashish. And I remind, linguistically speaking, that the word assassin, okay, in our languages, comes from Arabic hashish, hashishin. This appeal is addressed to the believers and demands from them an effort of jihad. One can admit that what is delirious is not an appeal to do a jihad, but the desire to put it into practice. The problem is that if a religion appeals to take lives of the others, it is normal that the justice shows some interest in it. But the justice says, in substance, if you commit these acts, especially after having smoked hashish, you are not responsible. We cannot judge you, neither can we punish you. We can only take care of you, of your mental health. The judges do have good intentions, not to say that these acts are to do with Islam. Everybody knows that the relationship is close, but it's not good to say that. As the relationship with Islam seems to be evident, it cannot be allowed to say that the discourse associates who quote to the letter the sacred text is a religious discourse. It can only be psychotic. Otherwise, it's the whole religion that might be accused in being mentally disturbed. And this religion wants to install itself within the society that it actually contests, because Islam contests the backgrounds of the secular society. So we have to admit that the victims of the Islamist murders are sacrificed twice. They are sacrificed, religiously speaking, especially when their throats are cut by knife, which was not the case of Halimi. To cut the throat is an example that you can find in Quran. The Jewish tribe of Medina was vanquished by the Prophet, and all the men of this tribe had their throats cut, which is a historical fact. But the victims are also sacrificed by the secular judges, who state that these acts supported by these words are out of the limits of reason and reveal the mental pathology. So the question stays open: who do judges want to protect? It's proved that the fundamental Islam produces murderers in the name of God. Of course, many well-intentioned people will never do that. And many people think that if we admit this fact, we'll condemn our Muslim compatriots. And there is a different opinion who says, and this is an opinion of many Muslim compatriots, that the recognition of these facts may on the contrary serve the Muslim community. And last, the inhibition doesn't come from Muslims, but from the state, who is afraid of Muslims. I remind that the police was present the day at the moment of the murder of Sarah Halimi, but it didn't intervene. Now I will conclude the whole talk, trying to get together all the elements of what I said. The contemporary French forms of anti-Semitism are covered by anti-Zionism, which consists in accusing Zionism in the name of the Holocaust. The idea is as follows. Jews were singled out as such by Hitler. Before the Holocaust, they were individuals living in different European countries. Today, they claim to have their own communal life on the state of Israel. They want to be people, which means that they follow the Hitler paradigm, since they identify with Jewishness as defined by Hitler, whereas they are just human beings. I actually quote one of the well-known philosophers, Alain Badiou, here. Refusing to be a human being without any particular national, cultural, or historical self-definition, they become the enemies of a conception of human rights that only recognize individuals and not citizens or nations. And so I'm coming to the beginning of my talk, talking about the postmodern philosophy. Israel thus becomes an obstacle to the establishment of this international order. And the main interest of these ideological patterns is to be able to modify the perception of reality by focusing on the weak linguistic and critical awareness of the majority of social actors. A language codified by the system of dominant ideas leads us to a stereotyped vision of reality, which produces a unilateral point of view. The doxic elements mobilized by these argumentative processes gradually settle in the common language and in the collective memory, frame the social actor's perception and seem to appear as an evidence. Today, we face the results of this common knowledge that was elaborated in the course of centuries and especially in the course of the last century, nourished by the conflation of various ideological and political configurations. Several generations in France of our contemporaries, non-Jewish as well as Jewish, were brought up on this anti-Jewish and anti-Israeli dogma, painstakingly presented as humanist, universal, and morally founded by dominant social political discourse. The only reality they know is the one created by these discourses I have briefly presented here. Thus, the continuation of a millennial tradition of anti-Semitism is assured without interruption. To break with this poisonous conditioning, the whole system of education has to be changed in Europe and especially in France. Thank you very much.